So back in our Manage Form demo project, I've added a load query button. And in the implementation, I've just put code very similar to what we had in the previous example. And here we're loading the collection of lists. But maybe I don't want all the lists. Maybe I only want the lists that, match some sort of criteria. So let's just get rid of this code here. And then let's say here var query is equal to from list in web.lists where, and let's say we want lists that aren't hidden. So list.hidden is equal to false. And maybe we want lists that aren't empty. So list.item count is greater than 0. And I want to select those lists. So select list. All right, so there is our link query. And then what I need to do now is just pass this query object here off to the load query method. So I'm going to say here context.load query, passing in the query object, right? And load query returns an IEnumerable of list, so I need to put a return value or have the return value captured. So we'll call this guy lists. So lists equal to context load query. And then once we call execute query here, this lists object will get populated. So instead of writing web.list.count out, we're going to write out lists.count. So what F5? Oh, we've got a build error. Oh, okay, because this is an IEnumerable, so the count is now an extension method, not a property off of the collection. Now let F5 again and click our load query. And there we go. We have 6 lists that aren't hidden and have at least one item in them. Now, as I mentioned in the slides, there are some operations that you might try to use in your queries that aren't supported in the client object model. So let's just look at one example here. Instead of checking the item count property off the list, let's just check the count property off of its fields. So let's say we want any list where the field count is greater than, say, 20. All right, so we'll hit F5, and we'll click the load query button. And we get an exception here saying that the count member cannot be used in the expression. Now, I haven't found any sort of comprehensive list that says what operations are supported and what operations aren't. So you'll kind of come across them sort of, individually as you're developing applications for the client object model. One other thing to be aware of is the parameters that you can pass into the load query method. So you can see it's expecting a client object collection of T. Right? Well, in the case of our existing link query, this is an iQueryable of Microsoft.SharePoint.Client.List. So Microsoft.SharePoint.Client.List is something of type client object collection, so that works out fine. But let's say we want to do another kind of query here. So instead of trying to find the all of the list information, maybe we just want to know, are there any lists that aren't hidden? Right? So let's just comment this guy out and then say here, var query is equal to web.lists.any, and then L goes to L.hidden is equal to false. Right, so this is a perfectly valid link query, but if you notice that the return type here is a Boolean, and this is expecting a collection, so that's just not going to work either. All right, so if you just stick with standard select, where, order by, the standard things you would write in a query, you'll be fine. But once you start to get into the more esoteric parts of link, there's a decent chance that what you're going to try to do won't be supported when you pass that off to load query. Okay, so now let's switch over to the JavaScript demo. So I've added a new button called the load query button. And back in our app here, I have attached the event handler for the click event. And then down here, I have the code, very similar to the code we saw earlier, where we're going to use load, passing in a reference to the list collection, and then write out the count. So if I put a breakpoint here and then hit the F5 button and call load query, and then we'll just inspect the object, we can see what it looks like. And while we can't really get the exact type name, this is an sp.list collection, right? So if I stop this and now just change this around a little bit and say here var mylists is equal to context.loadQuery lists. And then, whoops, sorry, a couple typos there. So that would be var mylists. And then grab that and then come down here and then write out my list. And it's going to be an array, as I mentioned. So instead of get count, we're going to use length. So now hit F5. Click our load query button and hover over my list, and you can see it's a standard array. Now, the items in the array are SP list objects, right? But the collection itself, instead of being a client object model collection type, it's just a JavaScript array. So in the JavaScript implementation, those are really the only things that are different. Is the object populated in place, or is the return object populated? And if the return object is a collection type, is it an array, or is it a type coming out of the client object model?